Welcome to my garage. We are going in this garage. We will be doing several videos to work on and service a couple of small engines for this transportation class. Now, the first patient we have is a chipper shredder made by Craftsman, which is 4 horsepower. And I know that some of you may be asking, why are we working on a chipper shredder when we're talking about transportation? And that's an excellent question, and here's why. If you remember from the way that we have reviewed transportation, transportation is simply the movement from one place to another, people or products. In order to do this, all transportation systems must have some type of a power source, a way to control and direct that power source for both speed and direction in order to complete the process of transporting from one place to another. With these small engines, there is a power source, in this case, a very small engine, that can be used either for creating power for transportation, meaning movement, or using that same amount of energy to create power for work. In this case, we're going to be working on an engine that could be used for transportation or work. This one's used for work, but it is still the same type of an engine. This is an internal combustion engine, which means that it is run by the chemical process of fuel exploding in a pressurized chamber when an electrical spark is applied. So in this case, you can see our fuel, in this case gasoline, from this fuel source here. And the spark comes from the spark plug, which goes down to here where we have our pull, just like any other lawnmower. We pull that to start, create the spark, create combustion in here, and the engine will run. You have 2 control mechanisms. One is the throttle, which controls the level of power that is applied, and the choke, which controls how much fuel is put through, literally choking off the supply to the engine. There is an air filter here because you must have air in order to create that combustion, and the air must be clean, or if debris gets in there, it'll hurt the engine. And then you have an exhaust. There has to be someplace for the byproduct of that exploding fuel to go. That is through your exhaust. It is discolored because it gets a lot of heat, and that's generally what happens, and this is not a new machine. Now, while we get into working on this, a lot of folks think that we need a ton of tools to work on an engine. And there is no doubt that I have a tremendous amount of tools. At least I have a lot of tool boxes. We haven't looked at everything that's in there. But I have a bunch of tools at my disposal. However, generally, you don't need a ton of tools to work on a small engine like this or many engines. You really just need a standard socket set. So we will work out of one drawer, out of one toolbox for most of the tools, unless I need a pair of pliers or vice grips or something really simple like that. But the point is, you really only need a basic tool set in order to perform basic maintenance and service on an engine like this. Now, before we begin with this, we need to do some homework on how to do it. Most students like to, when they want to build something, they say, hey, can I just jump in and build it? Or they'll say, hey, can I just give me a wrench and I'll start taking things apart. That's not necessarily a good idea. Remember, the rule in industrial technology is every single product begins on paper first before it is built. When you start with a product and have to do service, you have to go back to that paper to reference it and to do that service properly. In order to do that, you need a user manual. Now, the problem with purchasing this particular unit, which I purchased secondhand on Facebook Marketplace for $50, it was such a deal. It worked pretty well. I didn't include an owner's manual because we as masculine individuals, and for those ladies in the room, you know what I'm talking about, we usually grab the directions, throw them away, and say, I know what I'm doing. Well, you need to have a user's manual because there's key information. So what I did is I had to find the specifics for this particular machine, and you do that by finding on it somewhere a badge that has its manufacturer and model number. And then you can go online and search for manuals. Most of the time those manuals are available in PDF form, and then you can print those and have that information or just work off of your laptop. I generally choose to print them when I do this, so I have them in paper form and I can make notes if I have to, but that is up to you. So I dutifully went online and I found an issue. And in this issue is an important lesson. So here is the assembly diagram for this machine. This matches the model number. If you were to go up here and look at the model number, it matches the one on the badge. But unfortunately, the manufacturer does not print or produce the owner's manual for this item anymore. So I had to do a little more homework. Excuse me. What I found was, this is a 4 horsepower engine, and what they have is the 5 horsepower engine. Everything's the same. It looks the same. Everything looks pretty good. And what you have to realize is that there's a little bit of a misconception with horsepower. Generally with horsepower, we think more horsepower, we think bigger engine, we think different parts. However, horsepower is a calculation of how efficiently or how the engine functions. So when I found this 5 horsepower engine, what I did is I went to its assembly diagram, just like I had before. Now, if you look at this assembly diagram of a 5 horsepower engine versus this assembly diagram of the 4 horsepower unit, everything is exactly the same. I went through and checked all the items. So what happened is the Briggs & Stratton manufacturer who makes this engine, as the life of the engine went through, improved the engine. Now, horsepower is a calculation of RPMs, revolutions per minute, times torque, the strength, the foot-pounds, the strength of the turn, divided by 52. It is a basic calculation for horsepower. What they did is they made the engine a little bit more efficient, so it got a higher horsepower rating. Why do they do this? Because they can charge more money for the item. Because the difference between 4 horsepower and 5 horsepower is really not that much with an engine of this type. But what I need is reference material that'll help me with this engine. So I confirmed with the manufacturer looking for this item saying, does this manual service this unit in order to do proper service? And they confirmed that. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of homework. Now, when you get the full user manual, you get the internal workings, the part numbers, and the internal workings of the motor itself, the engine itself. From here on forward, engine and motor for me are the same thing, even though they can be slightly different. So it has all of the different items. Now, I said earlier that this is a 4-stroke engine. And your question to me is, Mr. Schreib, how do you know? Well, first of all, we're going to go back to our textbook. You're going to remember in our small gas engines chapter, there are several very nice documented diagrams of how a 4-cycle engine works, as well as how a 2-cycle engine works. But really it comes down to one key factor. A 2-cycle engine must have its lubrication oil mixed with its fuel as it works, because the piston section here actually lubricates the engine as it works. The 4-cycle engine must have it from 2 different places because there is a method of distribution of the oil into the engine. So let's check our motor. Our motor has oil here, fuel here, 2 different sources, 4-cycle engine. End of story. And I actually went online and did a little bit of homework because, as you know, I'm much more of a carpenter than a mechanic, and I like to be sure about these things, and that is confirmed. It is the simplest way to figure that out. So, what we have before we even get started is our basic tools. We have our reference documentation with our manual and our textbook for some contextual learning, which is always good to know because I like to understand how things work before I start taking them apart. Now, you certainly can start taking it apart and figure out how it works along the way, but generally you get that stereotypical moment where when you put it all back together, you get extra parts, probably because you didn't use the right documentation, and if the part was there the first time, probably was needed when you put it back together. So start with your manual. In your manual, you will find your important safety rules, as well as some key specifications. Now here, this is pretty good. Horsepower, 5.0. Displacement, this is how much the size of the engine. The spark plug, this is very important. Spark plugs have a specific number, which is based on the gap between the electrode, where the section where the spark is created, that gap based on strength, on the materials, and how far away that gap will decide how much spark is required. Every engine has its own specification for how much spark is required, so you need the right spark plug. This gives you a reference point of how to do that. Now, as I continue through here, this is a good reference tool, lots of good diagrams. It'll also say tools required for assembly: 2 7/16 or adjustable wrenches, which means my basic tools should be just fine. Now, of course, we're going to go through, we're going to look at the safety, we're going to see how it's going to be used, but we're way ahead of that. That's way ahead of us right now. Really what we want to do is we want to look at this. So what cup of oil we want to do? We want this thing to be lubricated properly. The user manual will tell us, based on the type of temperature you live in, what type of oil is appropriate. That is key information. It'll also tell you where do we check the oil and where do we drain the oil. It'll also go through the engine and identify its major components so you know what you're looking at, and go through and identify your control mechanisms. Now, this diagram is a little bit different than the actual ones. That is not uncommon when you go model to model. Again, continuing, this is the sequence of assembly for the air filter, the air cleaning unit. You need a clean engine. Like I said, if the air coming into a combustion chamber is dirty or there's material in there, it will mess up the engine. We want to keep that air nice and clean. So it'll also give you periodically clean the muffler area to remove all grass, dirt, and combustible repair. We're going to go through through this process to make sure that we clean things appropriately as a manufacturer intended. This is how we check our spark plug. All this information is in here. You want to at least skim this so you know where the information is, and then you can go back and through. Here's your service and adjustments. It'll show us how to work through, and we're going to work through this to make sure everything works appropriately. And then it gives you a troubleshooting page, as well as how to order replacement parts. Now, most of these were printed before, because this is an older unit. This is before just about every manual you could find is online. So really, when you go to order replacement parts, if you know the model number and the serial number and the manufacturer and some of the specs, you can find it on Google, and it'll take you to several different places where you can get some parts. The other engine we're going to use in the investigations for this class, there's an adventure with parts that I will share with you, because it is certainly eye-opening as to how to work with parts, which is an important part of working on engines, is getting the right things to work with. So we have all of our references. We have our motor. What I'm going to do in the meantime is we're going to pull the spark plug. I'm going to pull off the feeder mechanisms because there's all that debris in there. And I'd like to get a look at the inside working of the chipper mechanism, as well as pull apart the air cleaner to see what shape that is in, and then we'll make our next steps from there.